What is good, everybody? Welcome back to another episode brought to you by the League FFB. Today, we're going to be talking about my top 15 tight ends for Dynasty Fantasy Football as we head into the 2024 offseason. So without wasting any more time, let's hop right into today's video and let's start talking about my top tier of tight ends. Now, starting at the very top, we're going to be looking at my S tier. That S tier consists of 3 tight ends, the tight ends being Sam LaPorta, TJ Hockenson, and Mark Andrews. Now, coming in at my tight end 1, that is going to be Sam LaPorta for the Detroit Lions. And Sam LaPorta had an incredible rookie year at the tight end position. In 17 games, he had 120 targets for 86 receptions, 889 receiving yards, and he also added 10 touchdowns to that total, averaging a total of 14.1 fantasy points per game. This was good for the 3rd best fantasy points per game at the tight end position of all tight ends in 2023. And if you drafted Sam LaPorta in your rookie drafts last spring, you're probably ecstatic with the pick and you're very happy because Sam LaPorta looks like he's going to be the next elite tight end for many, many years to come in this Detroit Lions offense. Now, coming in at my tight end 2, that is going to be TJ Hockenson for the Minnesota Vikings. And unfortunately for TJ Hockenson, he suffered a late MCL and ACL tear that will likely force him to miss some time in the 2024 season. However, before that injury, TJ Hockenson was on an absolute tear for fantasy football purposes. And I say that because TJ Hockenson had the largest target share of all tight ends in 2023. He had a 24.3% target share this season, and he was top 2 in receptions, targets, air yards, and fantasy points per game with an average of 14.6 fantasy points per game. Hockenson looks like a locked and loaded tight end 1 for as long as he is in Minnesota. And coming in at my tight end 3, that is going to be Mark Andrews for the Baltimore Ravens. And Mark Andrews has been as good as they come for many years now. Since 2019, he has finished top 5 in fantasy points per game every single season. And although he had his season cut short here in 2023 due to a cracked fibula that he suffered in week 11, before going down, he was top 5 in target share, route participation, total touchdowns, red zone targets, and fantasy points per game with 13.5 fantasy points per game in that stretch. And I say this jokingly, but as much as we love Zay Flowers, don't forget who Lamar Jackson's favorite target really is. Now, moving on over to my A tier of tight ends. This is a tier that consists of Trey McBride, Dalton, Kincaid, Kyle Pitts, and Travis Kelce. Now, coming in at my tight end 4, that is going to be Trey McBride for the Arizona Cardinals. And McBride was drafted in the 2nd round of the 2022 draft and was forced to play behind veteran Zach Ertz for the majority of his rookie season. Now, in year 2, Zach Ertz did go down to a quad strain in week 8 and then followed that up with an MCL and ACL tear in week 10. So this fully opened the door for McBride with a plethora of opportunity. From week 8 on, Trey McBride would become the tight end 2 for fantasy football in that stretch. He led all tight ends in receptions and was top 3 in fantasy points per game, averaging 15.4 fantasy points per game during that stretch. And although it was somewhat of a short sample size for Trey McBride, McBride does look like he is going to be one of the best young fantasy football tight ends moving forward in an offense that can likely feature him long term. Now, coming in at my tight end 5, that is going to be Dalton Kincaid for the Buffalo Bills. And I think Dalton Kincaid would be talked about better if Sam LaPorta didn't put together such an incredible rookie season. But do not let that take away the fact that Dalton Kincaid also put together a very good rookie season as well. In year 1, Dalton Kincaid was top 10 in targets, receptions, receiving yards, and yard after the catch. And Kincaid also averaged 9.4 fantasy points per game in a part-time role where he was splitting snaps with tight end Dawson Knox. Now, Dawson Knox has an out in his contract going into next offseason, and the Bills could save almost $20 million by getting out of the contract. So I do expect them to move on from Knox at that point. But even while Dawson Knox is on this football team in 2024, I fully expect Dalton Kincaid to have an increased role in year 2 regardless of Knox being there. Now, moving on to my tight end 6, that is going to be Kyle Pitts for the Atlanta Falcons. And Kyle Pitts has certainly been disappointing to those who bought into the hype when they drafted him in their 2021 rookie drafts. And I say that because Kyle Pitts has never had a top 10 finish in fantasy points per game, and he fell out of the top 15 in terms of fantasy points per game in both 2022 and in 2023. However, I do think that there are brighter days ahead. The stench of Arthur Smith has finally left the building. His distaste for the fantasy football community is finally out of the picture. And because of those things, I am now forced to believe in Kyle Pitts once again, and it's hard to imagine that a new coach won't be thinking of ways that he can use an explosive weapon like Kyle Pitts moving forward. And now the final member of this A tier is going to be tight end 7, and that is Travis Kelce for the Kansas City Chiefs. And Kelce has been the fantasy football GOAT at the tight end position for many, many years, and he even had a good 2023 season despite the way that some people currently feel about Travis Kelce. This year, Travis Kelce finished number 1 in fantasy points per game with 14.6 fantasy points per game. Obviously a step down from his previous 3 seasons where he was averaging between 16.5 and 21 fantasy points per game. But even with the step down, he was still number 1 in the NFL. Now, with that being said, I do think we do need to bump Travis Kelce down a little bit in our rankings, finally, just due to his age and that minor regression that we saw in 2023. But I do believe that Travis Kelce still has some tread on the tires and likely can be bought at a discount on some of your contending teams this offseason. Now, moving on to my next tier of tight ends, that will be my B tier, and this tier consists of 5 tight ends, those tight ends being David Njoku, Evan Engram, George Kittle, Cole Kmet, and Dallas Goedert. Now, the first tight end in this tier coming in at my tight end 8 is going to be David Njoku for the Cleveland Browns, and David Njoku finished as the tight end 6 on the season in 2023, but he really broke out after Joe Flacco got under center. And in his time with Joe Flacco as the starting quarterback, David Njoku was the tight end 1 for fantasy football. We have seen David Njoku now show us that he has what it takes to be one of the best tight ends in fantasy football, but I do have concerns about it translating to when Watson is the quarterback 1 for this Browns offense. In games where Watson was the quarterback in 2023, Njoku was much less efficient than he was with Joe Flacco, and obviously the financial commitments to Watson indicate that he is going to be their guy moving forward, whether the Browns really want him to be or not. So with that in consideration, we will see what David Njoku puts up in 2024, but I do think that this could be a sell high window for David Njoku if you can move up and get somebody in that A tier. Now, coming in at my tight end 9, that is going to be Evan Engram for the Jacksonville Jaguars. And going into 2023, I was worried that the addition of Calvin Ridley on this Jaguars offense was going to hurt Evan Engram's fantasy football upside. Now, boy, was I wrong, because Engram posted the best season of his career here in 2023 with a stat line of 143 targets, 114 receptions, 963 receiving yards, and 4 touchdowns. Engram finished 4th in fantasy points per game with 13.6 fantasy points, and Engram certainly looks like a focal point of this Jacksonville Jaguars offense under head coach Doug Peterson, despite the talent that they continue to bring in around him. Moving on to my tight end 10, that is where I'm going to have George Kittle for the San Francisco 49ers. And George Kittle has been super consistent over the last couple seasons, actively being one of the best tight ends for fantasy football. And honestly, this ranking does feel slightly low for George Kittle. However, Kittle averaged 12.7 fantasy points per game in 2023, and a lot of the red zone opportunities that he was getting in previous years have now gone to Christian McCaffrey. The Niners are going to be a very interesting team to watch over the offseason to see how they choose to navigate their cap space over the next couple years. George Kittle is one of the players that is due to see a significant pay increase in his current contract. That same thing goes for Christian McCaffrey. Brandon Ayuk is also due for an extension here very soon. And then coming up shortly after that, they're going to have to choose how they move forward with Deebo Samuel and Brock Purdy. So with all of that being said, something is going to have to give financially for this 49ers offense. And this is also an offense where there are a lot of mouths to feed, so I'm slightly tempering my expectations with George Kittle as he gets into his 30s. Now, moving on to my tight end 11, that will be Cole Kmet for the Chicago Bears. And the thing about Cole Kmet is he's gotten better and better every year, year after year, and posted his best season in 2023. Kmet had 73 receptions for 719 yards and 6 touchdowns, and he averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game, which was the 9th best in the NFL. I do think that the Bears could bring in another receiving option here in 2024 with all of that high-end draft capital that they own, but this ranking and tier feels like where Cole Kmet is going to continue to live, and he just feels like a low-end tight end 1, maybe a high-end tight end 2 for your fantasy football teams moving forward. Now, moving on to my tight end 12, that is going to be Dallas Goedert for the Philadelphia Eagles, and Goedert was dealing with a broken arm for some of the 2023 season, which did force him to miss about a month of football. We also saw the Philadelphia Eagles offense take a minor step back this season, but despite all of that, Goedert was able to post 59 receptions for 592 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns in 2023. Now, these numbers were good for tight end 12 from a fantasy points per game perspective, and he did average 9.7 fantasy points per game this year. I think that there's a chance that Dallas Goedert may be a buy low at the tight end position right now, because when he's healthy, he is being targeted pretty heavily in this Eagles offense. And I think that 2024, which will be a contract year for Dallas Goedert, will be better than what he put together in 2023. And now moving on to my final tier, that is going to be my C tier. And that tier consists of 3 tight ends, the tight ends being Jake Ferguson, Pat Freiermuth, and Dalton Schultz. Now moving on to my tight end 13, that is going to be Jake Ferguson for the Dallas Cowboys. And Jake Ferguson stepped in for Dalton Schultz this season, and he actually had a great year in his absence. Ferguson finished with 102 targets, 71 receptions, 761 receiving yards, and 5 touchdowns on the year. All of that was good for 10.4 fantasy points per game, which did put him in the top 10 at the position. Now, there are some question marks about the Dallas Cowboys moving forward, especially after their loss to the Green Bay Packers in the wild card round, like who is going to be the head coach of this football team moving forward, and is Dak Prescott the quarterback that they're going to be sticking with? All of those questions are going to be answered this offseason, but I do think that it adds some minimal risk to Jake Ferguson moving forward. Now, coming in at my tight end 14, that is going to be Pat Freiermuth for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Freiermuth is going to be going into a contract year here in 2024, and he did have a pretty rough 2023 season, battling with a hamstring injury and some bad quarterback play this season. Now, the good news for Pat Freiermuth is that he already put together a couple of solid seasons in Pittsburgh, so if he can snap back and regain form again in 2024, I do think he will most likely receive an extension here with the Steelers. And although Freiermuth doesn't possess the yak ability or that high reception upside as some of the guys above him, I do still think that he can be a low-end tight end 1 for your Dynasty Fantasy Football teams moving forward. And now coming in at my tight end 15, that is going to be Dalton Schultz for the Houston Texans. And Dalton Schultz signed a 1-year prove-it deal with the Texans last offseason, and then he went out and posted 59 receptions for 635 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. Schultz averaged 10 fantasy points per game in 2023, which was good for the tight end 11, and I do think he's worked his way into a moderate extension with the Houston Texans moving forward as they continue to build around their new franchise quarterback CJ Stroud. Now, with that being said, there is still a small chance that they don't re-sign Schultz, and the fact that he could be with his 3rd offense and team in the span of 3 years is a little bit risky and is something that we should be accounting for, even if I do think that the Houston Texans will re-sign him. Now, that is all I have for you guys today. If you did enjoy the video, go ahead and hit that like button. It is the best free way to show this channel some support, and it does show me that you guys truly do enjoy the content that we are putting out. If you feel like we got something wrong with these tiers, go ahead and put that in the comment section below. Would love to hear your guys' thoughts on this tier list. And additionally, make sure you guys are subscribed to the YouTube channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell. That way you never miss any of these future videos when they do come out. And last but not least, make sure you guys are a member of the Discord. We do have a link in the description to a free Discord. We are in there 24/7, 365, talking Dynasty Fantasy Football and helping you guys with your fantasy football teams. So with all of that out of the way, I will see you guys on our next video. But until then, peace out.